Hey crew, it's about time for to read from Mr. Popper again. I gotta get myself set up though. I wasn't quite set up when I started videoing, and that's okay because I haven't talked to you today yet. So let's chat. I gotta find a good stand to use here. This one will work. Let's see. Today, it's Friday for me. I'm hoping you're getting this on Friday. It depends on how long it takes me to download this, but Good Friday to you. Hope you have a great weekend coming up. Next week is going to be a little different. I know that this week there was quite a bit of work that I threw at you. Next week, we're going to simmer down a little bit on some of the work that I gave to you. So we won't quite have as much as this next week. But just a reminder on the challenge that I gave to you to make sure that you are... let's see if I can put this down. I'm going to put this down. Don't forget the challenge to build something. A couple of you have already sent me a couple of things, so awesome for that. And let's see, what else? Did you finish? Send a picture. When you send those pictures, make sure you put yourself in the picture with it, because I'm planning on, like I said, I want to get that out to your friends, classmates, all that kind of good stuff, because we don't get to see each other. It's kind of fun to get to see one another, so be sure to do that. Let's see, anything else? Oh, some of you have been taking AR tests. Nicely done. You don't have to email me to let me know how that turns out, because I can see it online, all that kind of good stuff. So, but you can if you want to, because I'm always glad to hear how you did on those tests and things like that. When next week rolls around, don't forget to send your work back to school. Have it ready to go. That folder that I gave to you, you can just put all that stuff back in the folder and give it to your bus drivers or get it back to school, however, and I'll have a brand new folder ready to go with you next week. Like I said, not quite as much stuff next week. Okay? So, yeah. Okay, well, let's keep going with Mr. Popper's Penguins. Mr. Popper's Penguins... if you remember, they're having some troubles with the penguin. They have a penguin now. It's a good pet. However, with having a penguin for a pet, they needed to get a license, and that took a little bit of trouble. Plus, he had somebody come in, drill some holes in the refrigerator. Now, Captain Cook has figured out how to use the freezer door to get in and out of the freezer. But now he needs to build his nest, or as they do it, with rocks and pebbles and such. So that's what our next chapter is all about. Chapter 7, Captain Cook builds a nest. Very reluctantly, Janie and Bill had to leave Captain Cook and go to school. They get to go to school. How crazy is that? We're kind of missing out on ourselves. Janie and Bill had to leave Captain Cook and go to school. Mrs. Popper was busy in the kitchen, rather belatedly doing the breakfast dishes, and while she dimly realized that the penguin was going in and out the refrigerator pretty frequently, she thought nothing of it at first. Meanwhile, Mr. Popper had abandoned his telephoning and was now busy shaving and making himself neat in honor of being the owner of such a splendid bird as Captain Cook. But the penguin, though thus neglected for the moment, was by no means idle. With the unusual excitement and having to go to market earlier than usual, Mrs. Popper had not yet got around to straightening the house. She was an excellent housekeeper. Still, with two children like Janie and Bill and a husband with such untidy ways, there is no denying the fact that she had to pick up the place rather frequently. Captain Cook was now attending to the picking up. In the corners of every room, he prowled and poked and pecked with a busy thoroughness. Into every closet he stared with his white circled eyes. Under and behind all the furniture, he crowded his plump figure with little subdued cries of curiosity, surprise, and pleasure. And each time he found what he seemed to be looking for, he picked it up in the black end of his red beak and carried it, waddling proudly on his wide pink feet, into the kitchen and into the ice box. And at last it occurred to Mrs. Popper to wonder what on earth the busy bird was up to. When she looked, she could only scream to Mr. Popper to come quickly and see what Captain Cook had done now. Mr. Popper, himself looking rather remarkable, as Mrs. Popper noticed later, joined her in staring with astonishment into the refrigerator. Captain Cook came up too and helped them look. "Ork, ork," he said with triumph. Mrs. Popper laughed and Mr. Popper gasped as they saw the results of Captain Cook's trips through the house. 2 spools of thread, 1 white chess bishop, and 6 parts of a jigsaw puzzle, a teaspoon, and a closed box of safety matches, a radish, 2 pennies, a nickel, and a golf ball, 2 pencil stubs, 1 bent playing card, and a small ashtray, 5 hairpins, an olive, 2 dominoes, and a sock, a nail file, 4 buttons of various sizes, a telephone slug, 7 marbles, and a tiny doll's chair, 5 checker pieces, a bit of graham cracker, a Parcheesi cup, and an eraser, a door key, a button hook, and a crumpled piece of tinfoil, half of a very old lemon, the head of a china doll, Mr. Popper's pipe, and a ginger ale cap, an ink bottle cork, 2 screws, and a belt buckle, 6 beads from a child's necklace, 5 building blocks, a darning egg, a bone, a small harmonica, and a partly consumed lollipop, 2 toothpaste lids, and a small red notebook. "I guess this is what you call the rookery," said Mr. Popper, "only he couldn't find any stones to build his nest with." "Well," said Mrs. Popper, "those penguins may have heathen ways at the South Pole, but I declare I think this one is going to be quite a help around the house." "Ork," said Captain Cook, and strutting in the living room, he knocked over the best lamp. "I think, Papa," said Mrs. Popper, "that you had better take Captain Cook outside for a little exercise." "Good gracious, but you are all dressed up. Why, you look almost like a penguin yourself." Mr. Popper had smoothed down his hair and shaved off his whiskers. Never again would Mrs. Popper have to reproach him for looking as wild as a lion. He had put on a white shirt with a white tie and white flannel trousers and a pair of bright tan Oxford shoes. He had got out of the cedar chest his old black evening tailcoat that he had been married in and brushed it carefully and put it on too. He did indeed look like a little penguin. He turned and strutted like one now for Mrs. Popper, but he did not forget his duty to Captain Cook. "Can I have a few yards of clothesline, please, Mamma?" asked Mr. Popper. Chapter 8. Penguin's Promenade. Mr. Popper soon found that it was not so easy to take a penguin for a stroll. Captain Cook did not care at first for the idea of being put on a leash. However, Mr. Popper was firm. He tied one end of the clothesline to the penguin's fat throat and the other to his own wrist. "Ork," said Captain Cook indignantly. Still, he was a very reasonable sort of bird, and when he saw that protesting did him no good, he recovered his customary dignity and decided to let Mr. Popper lead him. Mr. Popper put on his best Sunday derby and opened the front door with Captain Cook waddling graciously beside him. "Gaw," said the penguin, stopping at the edge of the porch to look down at the steps. Mr. Popper gave him plenty of clothesline leash. "Look," said Captain Cook, raising his flippers. He leaned forward bravely and tobogganed down the steps on his stomach. Mr. Popper followed, though not in the same way. Captain Cook quickly got up on his feet again and strutted to the street ahead of Mr. Popper with many quick turns of his head and pleased comments on the new scene. Down Proudfoot Avenue came a neighbor of the Poppers, Mrs. Callahan, with her arms full of groceries. She stared in astonishment when she saw Captain Cook and Mr. Popper, looking like a larger penguin himself in his black tailcoat. "Heaven have mercy on us!" she exclaimed as the bird began to investigate the striped stockings under her house dress. "It isn't an owl, and it isn't a goose." "It isn't," said Mr. Popper, tipping his Sunday derby. "It's an Antarctic penguin, Mrs. Callahan." "Get away from me," said Mrs. Callahan to Captain Cook. "An anteater, is it?" "Not anteater," explained Mr. Popper. "Antarctic. It was sent to me from the South Pole." "Well, take your South Pole goose away from me at once," said Mrs. Callahan. Mr. Popper pulled obediently at the clothesline while Captain Cook took a parting peck at Mrs. Callahan's striped stockings. "Heaven preserve us," said Mrs. Callahan. "I must stop in and see Mrs. Popper at once. I would never have believed it. I will be going now." "So will I," said Mr. Popper, as Captain Cook dragged him off down the street. Their next stop was at the drugstore at the corner of Proudfoot Avenue and Main Street. Here, Captain Cook insisted on looking over the window display, which consisted of several open packages of shiny white Bork crystals. These he evidently mistook for polar snow, for he began to peck at the window vigorously. Suddenly, a car wheeled to the nearby curb with a shriek of its brakes, and 2 young men sprang out, one of them bearing a camera. "This must be it," said the first young man to the other. "It's them, all right," said the second young man. The cameraman set up his tripod on the sidewalk. By this time, a small crowd had gathered around, and two men in white coats had even come out of the drugstore to watch. Captain Cook, however, was still too much interested in the window exhibits to bother to turn around. "You're Mr. Popper of 432 Proudfoot Avenue, aren't you?" asked the second young man, pulling a notebook out of his pocket. "Well, yes," said Mr. Popper, realizing that his picture was about to be taken for the newspaper. The two young men had, as a matter of fact, heard about the strange bird from the policeman and had been on their way to the Popper house to get an interview when they saw Captain Cook. "Hey, Pelican, turn around and see the pretty birdie," said the photographer. "That's no pelican," said the other, who was a reporter. "Pelicans have a pouch in their bills." "Well, I think it was a dodo, only dodos are extinct. This will make an elegant picture, if I can ever get her to turn around." "It's a penguin," said Mr. Popper proudly. "Its name is Captain Cook." "Cook," said the penguin, turning around now that they were talking about him. Spying the camera tripod, he walked over and examined it. "Probably thinks it's a three-legged stork," said the photographer. "This bird of yours," said the reporter, "is it a he or a she? The public will want to know." Mr. Popper hesitated. "Well, I call it Captain Cook." "That makes it a he," said the reporter, writing rapidly in his notebook. Still curious, Captain Cook started walking around and around the tripod until the clothesline, the penguin, Mr. Popper, and the tripod were all tangled up. At the advice of the bystanders, the tangle was finally straightened out by Mr. Popper's walking around the tripod 3 times in the opposite direction. At last, Captain Cook, standing still beside Mr. Popper, consented to pose. Mr. Popper straightened his tie, and the cameraman snapped the picture. Captain Cook shut his eyes. And this is the way the picture appeared later in all the newspapers. "One last question," said the reporter. "Where did you get your strange pet?" "From Admiral Drake, the South Pole explorer. He sent it to me for a present." "Yeah," said the reporter. "Anyway, it's a good story." The two young men jumped into their car. Mr. Popper and Captain Cook continued their walk, with quite a crowd following and asking questions. The crowd was getting so thick that, in order to escape, Mr. Popper led Captain Cook into a barber shop. The man who kept the barber shop had, up to this time, been a very good friend of Mr. Popper's. You know what a barber shop is? Yeah, it's a place where they give people haircuts. Specifically, most barber shops back in this time would have been just for men to go in. They might get their hair cut or actually have somebody shave them, which maybe I could use that. But that's a barber shop. So they're going in there and it says, the man who kept the barber shop had, up to this time, been a very good friend of Mr. Popper's. Had been a good friend. So we'll have to see what happens. Let's go one more chapter. Chapter 9. In the barber shop. It was very quiet in the barber shop. The barber was shaving an elderly gentleman. Captain Cook found this spectacle very interesting, and in order to get a better view, he jumped on the mirror ledge. "Good night," said the barber. The gentleman in the barber's chair, his face already white with lather, half lifted his head to see what had happened. "Nook," said the penguin, flapping his flippers and reaching out his long beak toward the lather on the gentleman's face. With a yell and a leap, the gentleman rose from his reclining position, left the barber's chair, and fled into the street, not even stopping for his coat and hat. "Aw," said Captain. "Hey," said the barber to Mr. Popper, "take that thing out of my shop. This is no zoo. What's the idea?" "Oh, do you mind if I take him out your back door?" asked Mr. Popper. "Any door," said the barber, "as long as it's quick. Now it's biting the teeth off my combs." Mr. Popper took Captain Cook in his arms and amid cries of "Gork," and "Gork," made his way out of the shop and its back room and out a door into an alley. Captain Cook now discovered his first back stairway. Mr. Popper discovered that when a penguin has found steps going up somewhere, it is absolutely impossible to keep him from climbing them. "All right," said Mr. Popper, panting up the steps behind Captain Cook. "I suppose, being a bird, and one that can't fly, you have to go up in the air somehow, so you like to climb stairs. Well, it's a good thing this building only has 3 stories. Come on, let's see what you can do." Slowly but unwearyingly, Captain Cook lifted one pink foot after another from one step to the next, followed by Mr. Popper at the other end of the clothesline. At last they came to the top landing. "Well, now what?" inquired Mr. Popper of Captain Cook. Finding there were no more steps to climb, Captain Cook turned around and surveyed the steps that now went down. Then he raised his flippers and leaned forward. Mr. Popper, still panting for breath, had not supposed a determined bird would plunge so quickly. He should have remembered that penguins will toboggan whenever they get a chance. Perhaps he had been unwise in tying one end of the clothesline to his own wrist. At any rate, this time Mr. Popper found himself suddenly sliding on his own white-clad stomach down the 3 flights of steps. This delighted the penguin, who was enjoying his own slide just ahead of Mr. Popper. When they reached the bottom, Captain Cook was so eager to go up again that Mr. Popper had to call a taxi to distract him. 432 Proudfoot Avenue, said Mr. Popper to the driver. The driver, who was a kind and polite man, did not laugh at his oddly assorted passengers until he had been paid. "Oh, dear," said Mrs. Popper when she opened the door to her husband. "You looked so neat and handsome when you started out for your walk, and now look at the front of you." "I am sorry, my love," said Mr. Popper in a humble tone, "but you can't always tell what a penguin will do next." So saying, he went to lie down, for he was quite exhausted from all the unusual exercise, while Captain Cook had a shower and took a nap in the icebox. So, a promenade is a walk, and that was quite a walk they got to take. Now, when I was a kid, I was probably about 11 or 12, we got a dog. His name was Jasper. Jasper was not exactly the most well-trained dog. He's kind of dumb, to say it nicely. He didn't listen very well, and if you called for him, he'd go running in the other direction. Well, one day I decided I was going to take him for a walk, and I decided I didn't want to walk. I like to ride my bike, so I was going to take him on my bike. So I hooked up his leash, which was about a 10-foot long leash that we had. It was one we could chain him in the yard with. And I decided I would use that because it was longer than his other leash, which was, only about 6 feet long, 3 feet long. And so I decided I'll use a 10-foot leash, give him a little more way to go ahead of me. And in my mind, I'm thinking this is going to work great. He can run, get some good exercise, and if I get tired, maybe he'll pull me on my bike. However, when we actually started going, things were going well. Until Jasper, my dog, decided that he didn't want to take the same path I was on. And without me realizing it, he saw the neighbor's dog, Toby, and Jasper decided he wanted to go play with Toby. Well, I had taken his chain and wrapped it around my hand a couple of times just because I didn't want to lose him because it took forever to catch him when he ran off. So, having his leash wrapped around my hand a couple of times, when he decided to take off, my arm went whoop, and my body went whoop, and I flew over the top of my bike and bam, my head went right down straight into the gravel. Now, it just so happened my sister happened to be coming out of the house at that moment, and as she came around the corner, she said, "Ah! Dad, what's wrong with your eyes?" Because my eyes were kind of going like this, I guess. She thought I was like freaking out or flipping out or dying, I guess. Well, she screamed, went running back to the house to get my mom. Jasper was running around with this, 10, 15-foot chain hanging on behind him, running off. And I was trying to catch my bearings because, well, I think I had a concussion that day. Thanks for that, Jasper. But from that time on, I wouldn't take him for a walk with his chain on my bike because, yeah, that just didn't work out so well. So now when I see Moira, and she, the past couple of days when it was nice earlier this week, she hooked our dog up to a chain and got on her bike. I said, Moira, that might not be the best of ideas, kiddo. It worked out for her so far, but I keep warning her, might not work out. But, maybe she'll live and learn like I did and Mr. Popper did. We'll get back to him on Monday. Next chapter is called Shadows. And we'll see what that's all about on Monday. All right? Have a good weekend, guys. And we'll see you Monday.